Hi, and welcome to episode 16, Lost in Intonation, How Tone Shapes Cross-Cultural Communication. So today we're going to dive into the fascinating world of intonation and cultural differences, because specifically that happens when you're speaking a language that's not your native language. We, as you guys know, we always talk about German, English, and French and how those three languages differ. And there are some similarities, but a lot of subtle landmines, if you will. Um, Unintentional rudeness. Yep, yeah, here all the time. Um, on the French side, maybe some charming misunderstandings, not so much on the German one. But let's explore the ups and downs and the musicality of speech.
Welcome to Culture Clash Parenting, the podcast where Astrid and Marissa share their joys and challenges of raising kids in foreign lands. Join us for heartwarming tales, practical tips, and lots of laughter as we navigate language barriers, blend traditions, and celebrate the beautiful mess of parenting across cultures. Let's dive into this adventure together.
I love this. So as we dive into it, let's first define what we mean by intonation. So it's not just how you say something, it's the tone, right? It's the melody of the speech. And so it can turn a statement into a question, right? Which happens a lot in English. If your voice goes down instead of going up, you can say the same words, but it has a completely different meaning. It can change a phrase into something that sounds more polite or more sarcastic, more bored, more enthusiastic. And why does it matter? Why does it matter, Astrid?
Because I sometimes say things and people take it the wrong way. That's why it matters.
Yeah, kind of piss people off. Or you can make people think that you're like their best friend in the world when really like you're trying to tell them off.
Really. Most of the time, it's just people are like, well, why is she being so rude? I To the point of where, guys, we were going to call this episode, I'm sorry, she's German, just because that happens all the time. People think we're rude because of the intonation in our voices, and yeah, to the point of where when James and I first started dating, he was going to print up little business cards that he could just hand out where it just said, "I'm sorry, she's German," because it would be something very innocent. Right? You know, some would go out to dinner and I would order something, and he was trying to be sweet and take me to like a German restaurant or a French restaurant, and I would order it, and the person would say, "Well, what do you want?" Like, well, whatever it was, ratatouille, and just for lack of a better thing, right? Sauerkraut, and they wouldn't understand. And I'm like, "Do you even speak this language?" And he was like, "I'm sorry, she's German. She will tell you what's on her mind."
I love that. That's a great example, right? Where and this topic came up because I was telling you about this interview that we had seen with Gary Oldman, where he was saying that when he first starts getting into character, the first thing that he does is figures out the accent and the intonation because it's so different. And the way you move your body when you're to match the intonation shifts, right? And so it helps him to understand how the character will move, and so that's like all part of it. So it starts with the speech, and I just thought that was so fascinating. And then you were sharing these stories of like, people just think I'm rude because, and so one of the like the example that you're giving is this like sort of flat tone, right? This sort of like, you know, do you even speak this language? Like, you're not trying to be rude. It's just this kind of, it's just a genuine question, but it's said without like the tones of sarcasm or the tones of
Right.
politeness that Americans would probably use, and that's why it comes off as feeling, as being interpreted as you being rude.
Yeah, and I don't know if I specifically said, do you even speak this language? But it was more, it was like, well, why don't, it's right here. Do you not know what you're selling? I mean,
Yeah.
and more of a, I'm trying to understand. I don't know. Another example, I actually, my cousin was in town 2 weeks ago, and we went out, and she was out of the blue. She was telling me the story of how she's got an American friend, and in in the past they would go skiing in Colorado together, and they'd be on the gondola a couple every run. Somebody invariably asks about the accent. Right, it happens to me all the time too. I go, "Oh, where's your accent from?" Because their English is pretty good. It's not super German, neither is hers. Where Germans usually they think, they don't think, and but we don't do that. So it's a little harder to place. But she got asked every time. Well, so where are you from? Where's your accent from? Oh, I'm German. Okay, so where in Germany are you from? Oh, I've been to Germany. Oh, I am German, which is a lot of times that Americans will say, I am whatever country you're from. And you're like, okay, really? So where were you born? And they go, well, no, I was born here. Oh, okay, well, but so is your parent? No, my great grandparents were, but they still consider themselves German. And it becomes this really long conversation every time, which is can be a lot of fun. But if you're there to go skiing, and I understand her, she was on the fifth or sixth run up, and again, the same question. And so eventually she was just like, I don't want to talk. And her friend turned bright red and was like super embarrassed. And she's just like, I'm sorry, she's German. Get that a lot. Some
Yes.
people, why wouldn't she want to talk? Well, because she's German.
Because she's German. I've never felt that I have permission to answer that way. When that question is asked of me, I get asked that question too all the time. And it's interesting because like intonation, like you were saying, just even in like the where are you from, like it can be different based on like your region within your country, right? And US has all these different intonations depending on what state you're from. And Sean used to tease me all the time because of how I pronounced certain words. Like I say Manhattan, and he's like, it's Manhattan. Like there's two T's. Why are you not pronouncing either of them? And I'm like, because nobody pronounces them. Like, right? I'm like, what is wrong with you? Like, similar to you were saying, I'm like, what? No, two T's together make no sense. Like it's just eh. But
Yeah.
it was really
Oh yeah,
interesting.
yeah. I don't pronounce them either.
Yeah.
That's funny. Never thought
Um,
about it.
maybe it's because I have German maybe it's the Germans in New York who are just like, we're just gonna totally kidding. But yeah, right. And then there's the Boston accent and there's a Southern accent, and like, and so there are these accents that shift the intonation. And when right? Like you can pick up on, oh, this person is from that region because of their intonation. And yeah, it always, we've told this story before. My Owen used to ask, like, do we have to speak British English or American English? When I would say, like, oh, we're going to meet like so and so, we're going to go meet some like English speaking people or like American, we're going to go meet some friends. And he do we have to speak American English or British English because the intonation's different, and he heard the difference, like even, as a young child, like understood that there were different words, but also the different language, or the different intonation. And you were talking about how when you first learned English in Germany, it was with a Leicester accent. So like a different intonation than, so yeah, it does it is such a part of your cultural identity. And then to have children, like when we first moved back to the state, or not moved back to the States, obviously, when we would first would go back to the States and we would see people we hadn't seen in a while, I would often hear people would often say like, oh, your kids have such cute accents. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like their English is perfect, right? Like their French is perfect. And they're like, but they could hear the influence of having, not been raised in America, surrounded by people speaking that same type of accent in their intonations, because most of the vocabulary that they learned, they picked up in books, not hearing it, but reading it. And so they had to figure out what the word, they figured it out from phonetics. And so they would pronounce it differently, or their intonation would kind of follow the French way when they spoke English, and it would follow the English way when they spoke French. Like it kind of got mixed up. And so people could hear that accent. And yeah, I was always like, oh, that's so weird. Like, I don't hear it because I was around them all the time, right?
I get that when I go to Germany. Every time I go to Germany after being here for a year, people will say, you have an accent. And it's not, they don't actually mean that I have an accent, because I don't. I speak German all the time. Every single day I speak German. But it's the intonation that's different. And at one point I had that conversation with somebody. I'm like, are you sure? I don't think I have an accent. Like I'm pronouncing the word exactly the same way. Each individual word is pronounced the same way. But it's the intonation. And I've had those conversations. If my I remember one time my parents had bought a phone, old type of phone, right? Like, so we're talking 20 years ago. They had been in the States and they bought this telephone system for the house at, I don't know, Sam's Club or Costco or something, because it was such a great deal. And you couldn't get those types of phones in Germany for that cheap at that time. So they brought it over and then realized it didn't work. Never tried it while they were in the States, which mistake number one. So all that worked was the base of the phone. It wasn't, the handset didn't work on one of them. And so we called Costco or Sam's Club from Germany. And we called from the base. And my father got on the phone first, and he's trying to tell them this doesn't work. It doesn't work. And they were super rude to him. And so then I called back. And I'm like, okay, so my parents bought this phone. And I explain it. I'm like, they're like, well, but how are you calling me now? Well, I'm calling you from the base, but I'd really like to bring it back next month and exchange it. And is that possible? And of course they did it, right? Because in America, you can exchange anything,
right.
Anything. But I think part of it too is the background. It's not just the actual words. It's not just the actual intonation, but also the mindset. That in this particular case, the German, my father went into it. I can't do anything about this. I bought this. I made the mistake to not hook it up there, and they're going to say no matter what. And I don't even know why she's making me call them about me, right? But whereas I went into it, like, oh, of course, they saw it as a faulty thing. It's within 3 months. I'm going to go and exchange it.
Yeah, I think that concept of like the energy behind is huge. Like it's so it really is a big part of the intonation. For sure.
Which is why you can make something a question or just a flat statement, and it's the same words.
Yeah.
But I think that's also a big thing, is the mindset. So, my cousin saying, I don't want to talk. She really just didn't want to talk. So that's just a statement. Or me being curious, like, do you not know what I'm ordering? And yeah, that's super rude. I get it. I hear it's super rude, but I don't. And a lot of times it just kind of gets blurted out. That's the blunders.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I do feel like having grown up in an environment with lots of people who spoke different languages, uh, the one of the things that my dad used to do, and he still does, when he talks to somebody in English who speaks another language, is he tries to match their intonation and he tries to match their accent. And I always thought it was super rude. Like I was always embarrassed because I was like, dude, that's not how you speak. Like,
I was
why
about
are
to ask
you
you that
being
question.
condescending? Like, which wasn't his intention, right? But it was, and I'm not sure that other people took it that way. Um, but now being on the flip side, like when I've never had a French person that I can think of try to match my accent. I've had them make fun of my accent. So um, I think like it's almost like, right, I'm like, oh, that like like, and they're like blatantly making fun of my accent. Like they say I'm make like, oh, your accent's so cute, blah, 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 and then they try and imitate me. So it's clear that like it's coming from that place um of not trying to meet me where I am, trying to, and so I'm like, oh, like if is that less rude? Like, is it less rude if you tell the person I'm making fun of your accent, or if you're trying to match them because you're trying to establish rapport and be like, oh, okay, like I'm going to speak in your way so that you can understand. And it's funny because again, like we've talked about in other episodes, like my kids have never had a native English speaker teach them English in school. So they've always had an English teacher, even English teachers who've had really good accents, but they've always had accents. Um, and so it's interesting to have this conversation with them because they're, we always used to say, like, they're your teacher, you have to be polite and respect them and, don't correct their accent. Like, just learn how to pronounce it the correct way.
But then again, they're going to school in France. So maybe the teacher would not be opposed to them going, hey, that's actually pronounced differently.
Yeah.
You can, I don't know. In Germany, I think that's totally doable.
Even when
You
you
can
were
absolutely,
like 4, 5, 6 years old and your teacher was in.
no, by the time you're in middle school or high
Yeah.
school. No,
Yeah.
I agree. 4, 5, or 6 is maybe a
Yeah.
little.
Um,
But it's funny how you said you were embarrassed because your dad did that. Now your kids are embarrassed because you did it. Because I was about to ask you. So, because I've had my children say, "Mama, you can't say that like
oh,
that."
yeah. Yeah, no, I often, like we talked about what my kids will do is they're like, nobody under 50 says that. Like, right, like
Yeah.
or like nobody under, right, like or nobody over, like they'll insult my age, right? They'll be like, oh, like that's old, that's like Queen's English, or like, they won't call it Queen's English, right? Like they'll be like, oh, that's old French. Um, because
Yeah.
I'll say things like vachement, which was like a word that I learned in 1992 when I came to France, right? Which honestly, not for nothing, that translates as cowly, right? And it means like very. And I'm like, I think that's kind of cool. Like, oh, that it's like hella, right? When we talk speak in English, like that's the 1990s word for very. Like that's hella cool. Like that's cowly. Like I actually think it's really funny, but I understand that that's what that would be like me making fun of my parents saying like rad and like whatever and they would kind of go into their 1970s slang. I should be like, oh. So yes, there are those generational pieces on top of the cultural pieces as well.
Yes. All the time.
I'm curious
So
when you think about like your kids and the intonation that they have, do you hear different intonation when they speak German, when they speak English than what you have, but also that different than what you like other Germans and other Americans hear? Like, do you hear a difference in that mix?
yeah, I especially with my daughter because she's super fluent in all the languages, but her German still sounds more like an American is speaking it, whereas her English does not. She gets the whole, oh, you have an accent all the time from people here. which is crazy because she born here and grew up here. And
So, but I'm curious about that, specifically the intonation, because like we were talking about, like one of the things I noticed with Sean, who grew up in Geneva, right, in half the day in English, half the day in French in a bilingual school. I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong. He grew up half the time in French school and half the time in English school, different years, but then always speaking English at home and speaking French with his friends. I notice that his personality is very different, kind of going back to the Gary Oldman, like the intonation that he has when he speaks French changes his body language. Like it changes how he moves when he's speaking French versus when he's speaking English. And sometimes he'll say things like we've talked about before, like he's starting to speak French with a bit of an accent so that he doesn't get called out by people who think he's being rude. So we've shared that story before, that like he would speak as an American in French, and there's such a formality in how you speak to people in French, like work people, that he pissed people off who thought he was speaking down and being rude, but he was just translating how he would say something in English
right.
into French. And so as he started to say, okay, I'm going to change my accent in French to sound more American so that doesn't happen, it's changing his intonation in how he speaks. So his like voice is going up when normally in French it wouldn't, or it's staying flat when normally in French it wouldn't.
It would.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, especially with Franzi having gone back, and then like, do you notice shifts and changes in the intonation, like in how, not just how she's pronouncing the word, but like the melody of how she's speaking?
A little bit, but she doesn't speak that much to me because I correct her all the time.
She's almost 18.
That too, but also she likes to text me in German more than she actually likes to speak in German these days.
Oh, that's funny.
We'll see
Especially
tonight.
since her German probably, like she's speaking in like street German. Like we were talking about before,
Exactly.
language, having just been there for a year, like she's probably speaking in a much more culturally, like today speak.
As opposed to me, who speaks in a culture like 30 years ago speak.
Yeah,
Oh,
I mean, that
funny.
was Sean's thing, right? Like he was like, yeah, I speak French like a 14-year-old because I was 14 when we moved back. Like I speak French fluently, but I have the vocabulary, or the formal training of how a 14-year-old would speak, which was why he wasn't saying like Madame, Monsieur, like avec mes salutations distinguées, right? Like,
right.
that formality. He was just like, bonjour, like, I need this. Like, thanks.
Right.
Right? Like, he was grammatically correct, but he was being culturally rude.
That's fine. Yeah, I've noticed I'm definitely a much nicer mom in German or French than I am in English. And that's because I picked most of it up as a teenager, where, come to think of it, we had this conversation before, and it's going to have to be a different episode because we're running out of time, but about rude words, like actual bad words in the different languages. But when I was 16 and in college in the United States, I picked up some pretty foul language. And when I get angry, that still kind of comes out in English. And I would not do that in French, and very rarely in German.
Yeah. It's interesting
So,
that you're talking about that, because I think, to me, because I still don't have the confidence in my pronunciation in French, and therefore in the intonation, like my intonation in French is much more the way that I speak in English. I notice that like, so I'm much more insecure when I talk. I also feel like the way that I express my anger, the way that I express my emotions is different in my speech
Right.
because I don't give myself permission as much to get angry because I don't have the vocabulary to be angry in French the way that I have the vocabulary to be angry in English. And so if I'm in a situation where I'm angry, like I get much more like shaky and I stop speaking. I stop caring about the accent and I go much more into the like, I'm just gonna like get this out. Like, and I don't care if I'm speaking grammatically correct. Um, and I don't care about my pronunciation and my intonation. And I think it shocks people because there is, like we talked about, this um flatness when there's a different intonation in when you express things differently with different emotions that doesn't translate as well when you're just translating word for word. And so when French people are angry, it sounds very different than when American people are angry. In
That's
terms of
funny
like
you would say that.
how they are speaking, how they yell, how they like the melody, the sing song of the emotion is very different. And
I
sometimes
agree.
like I don't like you were saying how we started this story, like or started this episode, like you're not trying to be rude, you're not trying like it's just you're just like I don't understand. And that cultural difference makes it come out differently than, you know, for somebody who is expecting it to sound differently, to sound to hear your confusion presented differently than how you're presenting it.
Or not presented at all.
Or
Maybe a
not
lot of
presented.
times, I feel like this whole there's a phrase in the United States where to if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Yeah.
Germans don't
So
have that phrase, is
any
what I'm hearing you
yeah,
say.
any kind of criticism is not nice. And like in France and in Germany, we complain, and if we find somebody who complains along the same line, now we're best friends. Like that's
Yep,
how people connect. Um, but
100%. And you're going to say
what you
pretty much what you think, even if it's not nice.
exactly. If I buy a new outfit, I will ask a German or a French person if it looks nice, not an American. Like my French friend will look at me up and down and go, "Did you get dressed in the dark?" Um, but
Yeah.
to your point from before, real quick, and this is for any parents who are raising third culture children. Um, you had I totally lost my train of thought. I don't know
About
what
asking
I'm doing here.
intonation, the sing
But
song.
the sing song, no, but also the fact that you said when you get angry in French, you're missing the words. So my son's German is not nearly as great as my daughter's, and therefore, if he's angry, if he's agitated, or he just wants to argue things out, if I make him switch to German, and I literally will not engage in the English conversation because one, I now speak like a 16-year-old and I use words that probably shouldn't be used by a parent because now I'm angry. And two, he is much calmer because he needs to actually think about what he's going to say. So
Yeah.
I found that super helpful. Because I noticed it on my own language issues in different cultures. I found that super helpful for raising my kids in who are much more comfortable with English than they are with German or French, and but them being raised here too. I don't want them being rude to me like that. Certainly not in public, and I certainly don't want to yell at them in public like that. So it's easier for me to switch into a different language.
Yeah.
Running out of batteries, so I have to go find a power.
Well, it's perfect timing because we were going to wrap this episode up anyway. So we're always curious to hear your stories, to hear, you know, what do you notice when you're speaking one language versus the other in terms of your intonation, in terms of how you express your emotions, your feelings, and what do you notice about your culture, when you compare it to how you grew up, the culture that you grew up in versus the culture you live in, or vice or your culture, your generation versus your kids' generation. in terms of these things.
What
Like,
do your kids say?
yeah, do your kids say, "Oh, she's like she's not rude, she's just German"?
Something like that.
Is that what your partner says about you? Here's a business card. I love that.
I would love I would love if you're from another culture other than Germany, France, or the United States. I'd love to hear your story because I'd love to find out if there's anybody else who's as rude as German.
All right. Thank you so much for being here, for listening. As always, click like and subscribe if this content resonated with you. And thank you, Astrid, for being such an amazing friend and being on getting through 16 episodes with me, putting up with my intonations and emotions through 16 episodes.
Mine is
and
worse,
18
so
years.
thank you. Sure. Thank you so much, Marissa. Thank you guys for listening and tuning in. You can find us on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. You can email us at cultureclashparenting@gmail.com. And we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you again in 2 weeks. Bye.